Everyone is wearing a mask. I hope everyone has turned off and silenced their phones. And thank you very much for being here tonight. We're very excited to host tonight's event with Teddy Wayne presenting his new book, The Great Man Theory. Came out this week. Congratulations, happy Pub Day. He will be talking with, yes, here's the flowers, yes. He will be talking with Susannah Cahalan. Cahalan? I think I did it right. Cahalan. You're like, yes, thank you. So you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a couple of housekeeping things. We do have a recording going on this evening, so it will be available on YouTube after the fact. We have signed copies of the book available for sale at the register. After the event, once you've purchased your signed copy, you can have it personalized here by Teddy. We also have Susannah's book available as well. So thank you for turning off your cell phones, for wearing your masks, and on with the show. Our interviewer for this evening is Susannah Cahalan, who is an award-winning #1 New York Times best-selling author, journalist, and public speaker. She has written for the New York Times, the New York Post, Elle, The New Scientist, and BBC's Focus, as well as academic journals, The Lancet, and Biological Psychiatry. Susannah will be speaking with our featured author, Teddy Wayne. Wayne is the author of Apartment, Loner, The Love Song of Johnny Valentine, and Capitol. He is the winner of a Whiting Writers Award and an NEA Creative Writing Fellowship, a former columnist for the New York Times and McSweeney's, and a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, and he has taught at Columbia University and Washington University in St. Louis. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, the writer Kate Greathead, and their children. Wayne highlights some of the strangest strains of our current political turmoil in his new novel, The Great Man Theory, praised by Esquire as a wise, grimly funny, dyspeptic satire of the Trump years. Paul is a recently demoted adjunct instructor of freshman comp, a divorced but devoted Brooklyn dad, and a self-described curmudgeonly crank, cataloging his bitterness toward the priorities of modern life in a polemic he's calling the Luddite Manifesto. Outraged by the authoritarian creeps ruining the country, he is determined to better the future for his young daughter, one aggrieved lecture at a time. But shockingly, others in his life aren't very receptive to Paul's scoldings. So you're in for something special tonight. Teddy will be reading from the book, then Susannah will join him in conversation, and then you all will have the chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming Teddy and Susannah to the stage.
Thank you guys. Thank you all for being here. Thanks. Good to see you all. I want to thank Emily, my publicist, Emily Fishman, my editor, Daniel. Is he here? Daniel Lavelle. There he is. My agent, Jim Rudman. Thank you guys. And thank you all for coming here tonight. It's probably been a while since I've seen some of you, I would guess. I would think maybe 2+ years. Obviously, I probably had the last readings for Apartment in February, March 2020. Obviously, after that, as you all know, for seniors, I entered a cryogenic sleep chamber and was frozen for 2.5 years, and I just got unfrozen today. And it's good to see you all. I know why you're all wearing masks. I'm not caught up on the news at all. I know what's happening. I'm going to read just briefly from this book, and then Susannah and I will talk for a little while, and then I'm happy to answer questions from the audience. This is a little past midway through the book. Paul is a divorced dad. He has a daughter who's turning 12. He's insisted on throwing her slumber party sleepover for her birthday, despite the fact that he's not good at this sort of thing. He also lives with his mother now in the Bronx, so at her apartment. And Mabel lives in Brooklyn. So it's a disaster to begin with, and it might get a little bit worse in this scene, I would think. So I'll pick up a little into the scene. He's just gotten into a fight with one of the girls' mothers her mother because she wouldn't let her ride in the front seat. So he's had to make 2 trips to Brooklyn, and he's already in a bad mood. They arrived home over 2 hours later than the itinerary had ordained, picking up dinner en route. Mabel complained that they'd all been, quote, starving. What about the snacks? You got, like, health food, she said. Everything he bought had some vegetable component or at least connotation. Nutritional standards he assumed the girls' parents, and now Mabel, would have demanded. They were disgusting. Well, the pizza's hot, he said. The other girls swarmed the 2 boxes, but Thea peered at them from a distance. Is one of them gluten-free? She asked. This is the girl he had to pick up. I'm pretty sure neither is, Paul said. Oh, then I can't have it. Can you maybe eat just a little, or scrape the cheese off and eat that? She shook her head. It was likely her overprotective mother's adoption of a fad Park Slope diet, but he didn't want to incur further wrath from that woman by violating it. Paul called the pizzeria, which didn't have a gluten-free alternative, and 2 other places in the area didn't pick up. Before he dealt with the solution, he told the girls to choose a movie to watch. They unanimously selected the new release, and the only option was to buy it, which cost $20. He laboriously punched in his credit card information. This chair's so gross and old, Mabel said, stroking the deteriorating fabric of the green velvet armchair next to which she was sitting. It's molting. Her guest squealed. Chairs don't melt, one exclaimed. I said molting, Mabel maintained with dignified calm, like when a bird sheds its feathers. Paul was upset by her willingness to insult her grandmother's furniture for the benefit of her friends, but proud that she alone knew what molting was and hadn't caved to the mockery of the group. What about Chinese? He asked Thea from the kitchen, rifling through the drawer of takeout menus. All his mother ever ordered in was Chinese food. That usually has gluten unless it's a really nice place where they promise they won't use it, Thea said. None of these places was really nice. He foraged through the refrigerator. The only thing he deemed safe and palatable to a young girl was an unopened box of greens. How about salad, he offered. Thea looked forlornly at the girls devouring the pizza. I guess, she said. Paul dumped the greens into a bowl, splashed some balsamic dressing from a bottle, and served it to her. He was about to disappear into his room when the TV screen went black. Dad, Mabel cried. Relax, he told her. It'll restart in a minute. A minute later, it hadn't. He unplugged and plugged the streaming device back in. Nothing changed. The Wi-Fi was out on his phone, too. He went through the same routine with a router and the modem stationed in his room, but couldn't restore the connection. I'll call the internet company, he assured Lauer and Mabel. I'm sure they'll fix it right away. After 15 minutes of automated menus, hold music, and 3 interdepartmental transfers in which he had to reiterate his mother's account information and the nature of the problem, he reached technical support, which asked him to go through the restarting paces again. When that didn't work, the tech support guy told him he would reset his connection remotely. Mabel yelled into his room for an update. I'm trying to fix it, he called. The reset also failed. So the problem is you're not getting an internet signal, said the man on the phone. Oh, really? Paul said. There's no internet. I didn't realize. That's good to know. If the situation doesn't resolve on its own, a technician will have to come in and examine your connection. That's it? You're hoping it magically resolves on its own? Sir, I've done everything I can do remotely. Can we get someone over tonight? No, sir, that won't be possible. If you like, I can expedite this and get the technician tomorrow between 1 and 6 p.m. So I have to be ready for them anytime in that 5-hour window. Perfect, thank you. That sounds absolutely ideal. Sir, are you confirming they would be available in that window? I don't have any choice, do I? Paul said. You made it so we're addicted to this brain-addling technology, and then when it doesn't work, we have no idea how to fix it ourselves, so we need you to come in, but not like a normal appointment where somebody says, I'll be there at this time. No, it's I'll be there at some vague point during the day, and oh yeah, if you're in the bathroom and don't answer the door in time, I'm leaving and it'll take 3 days to get another appointment. The man didn't speak. Paul had contempt for people who took their frustration out on customer service representatives. I'm sorry, he said, it's been a long day. Please schedule the appointment. Someone will be here. He returned to the girls and explained that the internet would likely be out the rest of the night. Let's watch the rest on your iPad, one of the girls said. It's not allowed here, Mabel said bitterly, looking at Paul out of the corner of her eye. I have a big movie collection, Paul said, tons of stuff for kids. He retrieved his plastic crate of DVDs from his bedroom closet and set it on the floor. The girls approached as if it were booby trapped. What is this? One asked, holding up a DVD case. For Whom the Bell Tolls, Paul said. It's a great movie and novel about, he anticipated a lecture from Jane, his ex-wife, about his scaring the children with a plot similar to fascism and Robert Jordan sacrificially mowing down the enemy with a gun in his dying breaths. Spain, but I don't think you girls would like it. No. She tapped the case. What is this thing? The DVD? You've never seen one? She rotated and examined it strangely. I suppose you're more into Betamax, he said. None of the girls registered it as a joke. Nor did you guys, by the way. I found something you'll like, he said, rooting through the box. The conventional children's offerings were slim, and he didn't have much of anything made in the past few decades except art house and foreign films. Something tells me you're not into cowboys and Indians, he said as he picked up the searchers. The girls looked at one another. Dad, Gimple scolded him. No one uses that word. Sorry, you're right. Cowboys and Native Americans. Indigenous peoples, she said. He recalled his grandmother in his teenage years, speaking of Orientals, and imagined he'd looked at her in the same horrified way Mabel was glaring at him now. Any of you ever seen A Hard Day's Night, he asked. The film was as apolitical and pre-adolescent girl-friendly a choice as his collection permitted. Mabes, I've shown it to you, haven't I? She shook her head. You guys like the Beatles, right? He asked. There was a silence after his question, reminiscent of his classroom. I think my dad likes them, the girl finally said. Everyone likes them, Paul said. They're the best band of all time. Well, not the best. Their early stuff is bubblegum and their politics are hippie mantras. And I generally prefer the Stone sensibility. But plus the Clash mattered a lot more to me when I was younger, or I guess I should say that the only band that matters, period. But in terms of innovation and prolificness and sheer virtuosity, no one else comes close, except Dylan for lyrics. He was actually very underrated for his melodies. The girls were regarding him as the subway passengers would a person jabbering to himself. Paul missed having friends. And I will stop there.
Well, this is really a treat for me personally because before I even met you, I was a huge fan of yours. I read Love Song of Johnny Valentine and just absolutely loved it. Went back to Capitoil. I followed you through Loner and went to the apartment. I remember the last time. One of the last times I saw you was at the apartment lunch. And it's just an honor for me to be like one of your big fans, to be here to be able to talk to you about this book. So, and I just think the passage you picked is so perfect because there's so many parts of this book where you see yourself and you relate until you don't, and then you start to really question all the things that you related, prior. And that was one of the parts when he starts babbling about the Clash and Dylan that I was like, this is too close for comfort. Because I too have done that in front of a classroom and it was very embarrassing. But so I want to kind of start with the kind of where this book emerged from. I mean, I think you've spoken about it's kind of obvious in a way in terms of what was going on in the world at the time. You started this in 2019, right? Can you tell me a bit about where Paul came from and when you first kind of identified him as someone you wanted to follow as a protagonist?
Yeah, I came up with the idea in August 2019. I had been working on something else that I discarded. And as happened in the previous book, I also put up an idea and then almost the very next day got an idea for something new, which was Dad's apartment. The same happened with this. We're clearing out the old, let this new thing in. It was August 2019. It was, peak Trump hell of just looked like this might be never ending. And after 3+ years of that, and I thought I should write something directly about this without maybe being so on the nose about Trump himself, but could I write about this a character who's as outraged and obsessed with the growing state of authoritarianism in the country as I was? But then it felt like too simple a who's not against authoritarianism. I guess actually 47% Americans are not, but who that might read a book like this would not be against it. It's shooting fish in a barrel. So rather than make it just about that, which is too such kind of a facile idea, to make it about the kind of person whose outrage consumes him, and it's about something else, not just about his fear of the lapsing into authoritarianism, but his own status in the world. And so I thought a liberal, middle-aged white male who is himself slipping into irrelevance might have a different, there'd be an oblique angle to attack this from. That wouldn't just be about Trump is bad and people who like him are bad. It's too easy. But rather, this kind of guy is, in his own way, not as bad as a Trump supporter is, but there are other things eating at him and driving him that are corrupting influences too.
And around this time too, you were writing a column for the New York Times.
I think
right?
I'd been fired by then.
Oh.
I wasn't been fired. I parted ways amicably. Yeah.
But it was future tense, right?
Yeah.
And there's I bet some of that influenced the Luddite Manifesto, which I'd love for you to talk about the Luddite Manifesto, which is Paul's great work that he's working on. Would you talk a little bit about that, and if there was a relationship with your
Yeah, you could get a taste of it, of his interest in that section, in that he's opposed to new technology and is upset by, particularly, its influence over his young daughter. I wrote that column for 4 years. Not every article, but most of them were some form of critically examining tech these days and what it's doing to us. And a lot of them happen to be about its effect on children. And I guess I started writing in 2014, maybe 2013 were the earlier ones, before I had kids. I do 2 now, and I guess I ended around when the first of them was born, but part of my anxiety must have been about when I do have children, what you do in this new world in which they have screens everywhere and things to press and ways to tune out that are far more absorbing and immersive and addicting than they were at my time. And there's plenty of stuff about TV rotting your brain when I was growing up, but I do think it's another level of perversion and damage to especially children. So Paul's working on this book called the Luddite Manifesto, which he's hoping will be his big breakthrough nonfiction work. And it felt like a good way to orient him that's not just about politics, although he connects it to politics, and any of us can talk very easily about how the correspondence between these technologies and political polarization, and extremism, and disinformation, it's pretty easy to connect the dots. So it felt like a good way to bring in an academic interest of his that's also deeply emotional in that it concerns his daughter as well, but also enlarged politically.
I also I think Paul could only be a writer. I really don't see him in any other profession. I mean, there's a level of delusion at the core of the Luddite Manifesto. He thinks this book is going to set the world on fire when he's done with it. It's going to show everyone who doubted him that, how amazing this book is. And I think that there's all of us, if you're writing, you have a level of delusion that perhaps is higher than the average person. I mean, could you see Paul as in any other career? I mean,
well, you're right. It could have been a man who just is upset by the politics around him and by technology around him and has another job. I guess it's an easy move to make him a writer. It's 2 books in a row where the person is a writer or an aspiring writer. And the next one I'm working on, the guy is not, and it's refreshing to get away from that. But I hadn't thought about that idea that writers are delusional. I guess I think of myself as the least delusional person in this room. Therefore,
no, that's me.
But that's a good point.
Yeah.
The dreams of grandeur.
Yeah,
I thought more about him being. You're right. He's sort of he's teaching at what he calls a third-rate or third-tier college. His work to date has not ever broken through in any big way. His status anxiety is deeply embedded in his character, and writers, I think, and any artist or performer, probably it hurts them more in that way than most professions.
and I think it segues nicely into the actual title, Great Man Theory. Can you talk about that and the kind of origins of that, kind of the hero narrative in history and how that applies with Paul?
So it is an actual theory put forth by the Scottish thinker Thomas Carlyle in 1840. The main quote, it's like a short 3-page essay, I think, but I only looked at the Wikipedia page, I don't really know. The history of the world is but the history of the great men who have labored here, and that great men, mostly men in his time, leaders by dint of their intellect or charisma or courage or other qualities, are the ones who drive history, not the masses below. It's a profoundly anti-democratic idea. It suggests that it's the Trumps and the Putins, unfortunately, or the Elon Musks and the Mark, they all suck. These people are pretty bad. It's these certain great men and women, more so now, who are the ones that are shaping the culture and direction of the world. it's many people have rebutted it and said,
Simplistic.
look at other movements, mass movements that have changed the history. There's obviously no correct answer. It's of course a combination of the two. But Paul is noting that at this time in world history, it seems to be rearing its head much more. If you look at any day's newspaper, it's probably the case if you looked at like 1955 too, you'd see last names of people in the headlines, but it seems very much so that in the past 5-6 years, it's names, Trump, Elon Musk, whatever it is, who are the ones driving headlines, specifically Putin, especially lately. Very much lone, specific people, or men often, who, if they didn't exist, I don't think if Vladimir Putin did not exist, I don't think Russia would be in a war with Ukraine right now. This one guy who really changes things, and Trump didn't exist, I'm not sure the Republican Party would have gone as cult-like as they have. It's certainly possible, but it does seem like there are individuals who rise above the rest and dominate and force us and bend us to their will. Not just in Roman politics or business, but in Roman culture too. Paul, as a writer of middling to lesser status, is seeing that people around him are branding themselves and becoming these identities and distinctive individuals as more than their writing, that they themselves as personalities and personae are getting more attention, garnering more acclaim than their actual work, which obviously displeases him as someone who thinks work is the most important thing.
Well, that's the question too. Like, what is a great man to Paul? Like, he's failing as a writer. He's failing as a father. He's failing as a son. Like, how does he see himself fitting in with this great man theory?
Well, I think so. There's that professional political status of clout that he certainly doesn't have. But on the more personal level, yes, his marriage ended. He's doing poorly as a dad for the most part. Not doing that well as a son either. Not doing well as a friend either. He's not a lowercase great man either. He's not fulfilling the roles. His professional career is bottoming out. He's not earning money. All these markers of traditional masculinity that we associate with what it is to be a good or a great man, he's certainly fallen short. And I think if those things were in place, he might not be as obsessed with the bigger national stage he's holding to command.
Now, I think it's been described, and I agree with this, as a Gen X satire. And I was wondering if you could speak specifically to the Gen X male situation and how, uniquely kind of, set apart by two, baby boomer millennials, and he probably views as pretty impossible generations. How do you feel that his rage, his place in the world, and his position as a kind of Gen Xer kind of situates him in this myth too?
Well, Paul is 46 years older than I am, and I have noticed I've had at least 3 men who were involved with me, either professionally or interviewed me, who at the time they read it were 46. And they all seem to really connect with it. and 2 of them, maybe they all mentioned that they were the same age. So I think the key is you write an age that is going to appeal to a number of readers and hope enough 46-year-old men in the country find it. It's a really narrow slice demographic. He's older than I am, but he's in that age where, I don't know if anyone here read, there's a big profile of Janine Garofalo, the comedian, in New York Times today that I read, who's 57, so she's older than Paul, who was a classic Gen X comedian and figure from the 90s. And it had an interesting take on that she never sold out, and that means she's not doesn't have a thriving career now in a classic sense of being hugely famous and successful, but she's doing what she wants to do still, and how that ethos has passed. The idea of not selling out was once critical to artists and is now the opposite, is what's being promoted, that you should sell out. And I'm not going to name names, but Susannah does a lot of promotion of that it wouldn't be as off-putting now for her to see a writer in like an ad for a luxury company, fashion company or something. But in 1993, it would have been perceived as, how dare you do this? So Paul, anyway, he's 46. It's the age where 20 years earlier, in the previous generation, that might have been his prime of his career. He might have been really coming into his own, and only maybe if anything, ascending in power and prestige as an eminence grise who has the sort of wisdom and maturity to comment on the world around him. Now, 46 is starting to feel a little bit ancient and out of touch, and it wouldn't have been the case in a previous time. He lives with his 86-year-old mother, who's this, it's not named, but watches the equivalent of Fox News and has become a pretty staunch conservative. And as you see, he's dealing with his 12-year-old daughter, who's clearly from a different generation, also teaching 18-year-olds in college who are, from their own generational perspective, he doesn't fit in with any of them. And his own breed is on the verge of not extinction, but maybe in terms of relevance, extinction. And so a man without a country really is kind of thought of him as, and that there's no other age that made complete sense. If you were in your 50s, you at least would have done enough, you would have gotten early enough that he might have been tenured by now, or done well enough that you'd say, all right, I'm 58, I had my time, but 46, you should still be building and building, and he's now just shrinking and diminishing.
You just mentioned about names, and I think that you didn't name Fox News. You also don't name Trump.
Yeah.
And Paul himself does not have a last name. So will you talk to me about that decision?
No, I won't.
No, please.
Yeah, Paul does not have a last name in this, and at first I just didn't want to give him an ethnicity, was my first thought for that. And he's white, but to not make him Italian or Jewish or Greek, whatever it is, give him a generic whiteness. But I thought of it more as not giving him, even in his own book, the prestige and privilege of a last name of a surname. If you look at, if you think about great men of history, you would refer to them by their last name only, usually. No one calls him Adolf Hitler, you just call him Hitler. And so Paul is the opposite. He's a man with only a first name in this. Trump does not get named, in part because I didn't want to make it too specifically a Trump-era novel. Of course it is, but to make it set in a semi-alternative universe in which this could theoretically exist in any era, and it unfortunately probably will exist in future eras to some extent. Fox News is not named either, just to avoid a libel lawsuit maybe, but other than that, the host he becomes obsessed with, who's a Sean Hannity-like TV host, does get his own name, Colin Mackey's someone else. But in part because these other people everyone else in the book gets a first and last name, just about every single person, I think, except for Paul, who gets only the first name, and then Trump, nothing. And I also thought, not only for those other reasons, but to not give Trump any kind of respect within this novel either, and to deny him. It's Paul, it's third-person narration, but if we think of it as indirect discourse, third person that's sort of filtered through Paul's consciousness, he would want to not give him this honorific either. Even though he gets in an argument on a first date with a woman who doesn't actually get an argument, she doesn't want to refer Trump by name, which people often did and do still. There was a time from like 2016 to 2019, I think, where people were like, oh, can we not mention his name? And Paul internally gets irritated by it and thinks, this is the part of the problem. We should talk about him all the time. This is, I understand the desire to put your head in the sand or just ignore the problem, but I also think I agree with Paul that we should confront it head on. And yet, Paul's doing some version of it in the narration here.
Yeah, I mean, Paul has a lot of rules. Like, you should only buy a bottle of wine. That's what is it? A third of your age plus 2 or something, minus 2 or something?
Comes up with something. I think it's like your age divided by 2 minus 5 is the minimum to get away with. It kind of works.
I like that, actually. But there's rules about if he really at one point goes on a diatribe about taking children to protests and like the little signs that are held up and how distasteful he's finds the whole thing. When you were writing, bringing out these parts, we all have these parts of ourselves where we're judging these things. I mean, when you were bringing that out in this book, how naked did that, like revealing some of these, proclivities that you had, or these kind of feelings that you, I don't know, I felt like it's at various points, like I was too close to agreeing with him at various points, and those were some certain examples.
I would say I share his baseline convictions about the world, but he goes, as you saw, I probably have berated a customer service rep in my time or two, but I try not to. He's much more confrontational than I am. and more bitter and aggrieved than I am. I hope he is. And so I thought of him, I've heard Larry David speak of his character in Curb Your Enthusiasm as a much more confrontational, aggressive version of himself. He wishes he could act like Larry does in the world where he gets in fights with people, but he doesn't.
Right.
I'm not that aggressive a person by nature. So I don't really feel that way, but I certainly have those kind of grievances or judgments that I have to think we all do, that I don't air or try to sublimate in some form or try to tamp down and try to see from another perspective. But it was fairly fun to
Yeah, I was going to say,
have
it was
them
a
to
cathartic,
call, yeah.
kind of cathartic to get all that out.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, that the animus just out, you know, like. Now, another thing that I found really interesting personally, because I have the same interest, is, you know, the past 3 books have really been about people on the brink, writing about this kind of line between kind of the sanity and insanity, basically. And it gets there here, which we won't get into, you know, any spoiler alerts. But I want to talk about what is it like to inhabit that space when you're writing and the actual process of writing that, because it feels, especially as the narrative moves forward, you feel like you can't put it down. It's very propulsive. Was this a fast kind of draft situation? Did you write this quickly? What was the process? And how did you access that space?
I wrote the first draft quite fast for me in 3 months or so, and it was much shorter than it is now. So it expanded the revisions. And I think you talked before about writing quickly produces a fast read too. In some ways it makes logical sense. You're probably not feeling as much detail and interiority, and therefore it's a more pacey. But the idea of these men on the brink, I remember hearing, it's in a screenplay, The Taxi Driver by Paul Schrader, the 1976 Scorsese, Robert De Niro movie, where he's described Travis as, there's a whole description of the character, and then he's heading toward violence, I think, is the final sentence of it. And I thought of each of these characters, Loner, Apartment, and this, as men who are in some way aiming toward violence. In Apartment, it's the most subdued version of it. And I won't reveal what happens in this, but that there are various pressures and forces that are compelling these men who are used to maybe bottling things up and unable to express them or articulate what's eating at them or have no one to express them to, and that these forces conspire to lead them to some form of unbottling of that tension and potentially for violence too. And it feels too like the one of the dominant narratives of our time. White male rage is a pretty serious offense. Not just like mass shooters. That's the most explicit form of it, but I would say the entirety of the Republican movement has become. There's some women in it too, but it's pretty much a political party that has become consumed by white male aggression and a thirst for violence, even if they might think there are other reasons behind it. Even if it's a rich Trump voter who just doing it for the taxes, there's some form of violence, I think, that's embedded within the policy and more so the rhetoric of it now. And this is now, unfortunately, who much of the nation has become.
It's interesting because it's Paul who gets wrapped up in this orbit, which shows that this kind of rage is actually not on one political side.
Yes.
With Paul. So can you talk a little bit about that and about how he gets radicalized really on the internet?
Yeah, so he gets into this, despite his Luddism, he gets into this website that's sort of the left-wing version of Fox News and starts commenting on articles and eventually develops a following there. And I think it just, I don't, again, in that just cascading the right is too easy for this. I think there are ways that anyone can become a victim of their own polarization and extremism. Even weirdly moderates who think they're above both sides and above the fray, there's a form of extremism in that too. So I think of Paul as sort of becoming what he most thinks he despises and what he most dislikes. That's my son making this noise. It's okay. You find this funny, I guess? White male rage is your future. So that not to draw false equivalency at all, but that he himself is succumbing to the same forces that I think his mother's succumbing to.
Right. That's about, I think. Were there kind of, I'm thinking of them as kind of cranks throughout literary history or film history, whatever, that you were drawing from or in conversation with in this book?
I wasn't specifically thinking of those two. In fact, there were movies, 3 movies I think were on my mind. One was Taxi Driver, one was all from the 70s or early 80s. One was Network, which is a great movie about Howard, a newscaster who's fed up and decides to start telling the truth, a little bit like Paul, and culminates in a moment of violence too. And The King of Comedy, another Scorsese De Niro pairing, in which a guy who actually lives at home and wants to become a stand-up comedian tries to get on a late night talk show and kidnaps a talk show host to get on it. And the same idea in that too of in this case, Paul hates the talk show host he wants to get on, whereas in that he worships him, but there's a love-hate thing in King of Comedy where he loves the talk show host, but you sense there's some anger too, not even that deep beneath it, very much in concert with it. And this too, there's a hatred of Colin Mackey, of course, but then a sort of worshipful reverence of him too. When he finally meets him briefly, at some point in the novel, he's too cowed by him and scared and sort of recognizes that Colin Mackey is more of a great man than he is. And so I thought of those 3 movies were touchstones of, and I guess it makes sense, they're also from a different era, even the era Paul himself would probably want to live in. I sort of thought of writing this as, even if I wasn't thinking about Bellow and Vonnegut specifically, it was like a 1970s novel. I probably would have done better if it were published in 1973, because it's more fitting with the time then, but he's the kind of character who, and it's the kind of novel itself that I think existed in more profusion back then.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense out of time, you know. We talked a little bit about the women in his orbit. You know, there's I think the main female characters. I mean, and actually, when you think about it, really the other peripheral characters. There are some men and there are some friends, but few of them. But most of them are women, and it's his daughter Mabel, who's 12 years old. His wife, I would call her
Jane.
Yeah, Jane. And there's his student, and then his girlfriend Lauren. Will you talk about these women and what kind of what are the roles in his life? How does he view these women?
Yeah, well, I guess every other male in his life, he in some form sees them as competition and compares them to himself. That they're a threat to him, or somehow he's perceiving them as, are they better or worse than I am? Every single one. I think he doesn't do that with the women as much. Instead, the women are all far more competent than he is. They are able to live life better than he can. Lauren, the woman he starts dating, is very successful professionally and knows that she's doing her job in a way that he doesn't for his own job, really. His ex-wife Jane has moved on, remarried, and is happy. His daughter seems to adjust better to the world than he does. Even his mother is dating again and seems to be in a more successful relationship than he is. So I thought of them maybe as foils in that regard, that they are the ones who better understand how to actually live than he does. There's a running motif of Paul not being, quote, good at life, is the phrase that his ex-wife has used. And that's really at the heart of his problem, is that all these political considerations aside, he just can't connect with people in a way that you're supposed to. And if that were in place, maybe the rest of it wouldn't matter so much to him.
A really moving part for me was the time when Paul calls his mother up. She's starting to watch Fox News. She has a kind of Republican boyfriend, and he kind of makes fun of her, and I guess is combative with her. And she says essentially that you've always thought I was stupid. And I thought that was so interesting, kind of some window into why why Fox News maybe is appealing.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about his mother and what happens to her?
The backstory is that his mother and his deceased father had him when they were old themselves. So she's 86 in this, so she would have been really the silent generation, not even a baby boomer. And I feel like that's the other generation that kind of got screwed. That they either lived through the Great Depression, maybe they didn't have to fight World War II, but his father fought in Korea. It's sort of being born in the wrong time in history. And whereas I think people born from like 1945 to 1960 or so really got the sweet spot of being born at the right time, unless they had to fight in Vietnam. A pretty good time to be born in America, especially if you're a white male. So his mother never got the opportunities that Paul's had. She is just a high school graduate. His father was too. Neither of them did all that much of their careers. And so he's had more opportunity for a better life than they have had. And I think there's this resentment from her, as elders often resent their juniors for feeling like you had it easier than I did, and yet you're still complaining. And this is more commonly done with baby boomers to, I think, millennials now as this sort of classic rift. But it feels like it's appropriate for them too. And that she's also, as a silent generation member, not even in his peers group for their parents. So it's another sense of him himself being out of time and out of joint, that he was raised by these people born in the Great Depression. Everyone else would have been raised by people who grew up listening to the Beatles, and his parents were already antiquated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This was I'm going to open it up for questions after this. 2 more questions, sorry, I have a lot of questions. But this is the first main character with a child. And this
in history of literature.
And how was it writing from the perspective of a character with a child? And you had, I think, when you started writing this,
Yeah.
Angus, and then it was
Phoebe was on the way.
Phoebe was on the way.
Yeah, Phoebe, I guess they came. No, when I wrote Apartment, neither of them was born.
Okay. So this is your first book written as a father.
And I do think it had an impact. There are scenes that I wouldn't have written without the existence or experience of it. Eggs and cream. But the fear, the combination of love and fear you feel for your child, that I think is pretty commonplace and universal. Of you really get worried about it's all wrapped up together. You love them so much, and you're terrified for, especially now, the future and the world they're inheriting. And that drove me to write this, but also drives Paul. If Paul didn't have his daughter in this, he'd be a pretty objectionable character without much redemption, without many redeeming features, that is. Mabel is really the only big point of access, I think, for most readers for him. It's where he is more tender and soft-hearted. And I think, likewise, if she didn't exist, he might not care as much about the future of the world. It might just be let it burn. Which not to say people who don't have kids should feel that way. I think it's much more admirable to care about the world when you don't have children, because you're not going to do it for your own blood. It's far more noble. So it's an easy out to be a parent and to care about the world because you're just thinking about your own kin. But again, it tenderizes him a little bit, and I think it's the core of the book is that while he's searching for respect from the world and to be viewed as a great man, I think he's really seeing his lack of that from his daughter that's developing, and that's what's maybe the most hurtful, devastating loss he's experiencing is the daughter pulling away from him and his daughter no longer respecting him as a man.
And my last question is, you've dedicated the book to, you know, there's kind of, I think, a tell about, again, we can't talk about the ending, but I do want to talk about the fact that the book was dedicated to your daughter. You call her, you say it's my brightness. So in the end, is that a kind of tell to the reader that we should be a little optimistic or hopeful at the end?
Well, these are very dark times, clearly. I do think there's a point to art that disturbs the comfortable as opposed to art that just comforts the disturbed, and it's what I've been writing, much to the chagrin of people around me, absolutely. But if it simply is just reveling in the darkness, that seems to be not useful. Unless it really exposes it and does something else with it. If you're just saying the world is terrible and we're all going to hell and that's it, what's the point of reading a book or experiencing any art form that does that? This book, I won't give away the ending either. I think it's a little bit more open-ended, and it's sort of how I think of the world too. It's he goes on that date with that woman early on, and she asks him, what will become of us? What will happen, do you think, to us? She says her students keep asking her this. A question I have to imagine everyone in this room has asked themselves many times in recent years. Either what's going to happen with COVID, is this ever going to be done, or more specifically, what will happen to this country? Obviously, none of us knows, but I do think there's something to be said for the self-fulfilling prophecy of being cynical about it. And the more pessimistic and cynical you are, not that one person can make the difference, but it'll become that way if we let it become that way. And if we all are more optimistic and idealistic, at least gives us hope to continue and opens the chance of there being a better ending to this. So why don't we end the question on that?
Okay, so
and happy to answer questions from anyone in the crowd.
Would you say that one of the people that would go along with the great man theory would be Napoleon? This will make sense in 2 seconds once you answer it.
It'll make sense in 2 seconds. Right?
Yeah.
Is that last bit? Yeah, for sure. That would be one of the examples of it.
Yes. But he's addressed by his first name.
Sorry, Daddy.
exception proves the rule.
He titled the book.
Is it?
Oh, well, that's the other alternative, right? There are people who are so big that Napoleon Bonaparte, I don't know why he was called Napoleon.
Wouldn't he be called Bonaparte?
I don't know why that was the case.
He's like a Cher, Madonna, one
Yeah,
first name.
exactly.
Any other? Yeah, please. Give me the other guy's name. Let's see if Do you have another question?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not a question. It's another way that I'm going to establish how much of a failure Paul is that he prefers the Beatles to the Kinks.
The Stones, yeah.
That's not true. That's not true. My opinion.
No, he prefers the Stones, he says. It shows that I thought of that as
Still, but like
he's
the
too
fact-
alternative to embrace the Beatles. He's more of a Rolling Stones
That's
guy.
funny.
Yeah. Okay. Susanna's going to take over.
There's one more.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand that you're working kind of in the screenplay world and Hollywoodish stuff, and that the great man might be working on something related to that we talked about previously.
Yeah, I just started adapting for TV, and I guess the only thing of note to say is that because it's primarily the British production company, we are setting it in London, and because the UK does not have the same level of authoritarianism or right-wing media that we do, we're setting it in the near future. So as opposed to the recent past of New York City, the near future of London.
Interesting.
How's writing screenplays? How has it been?
I adapt, I guess, all but the first one at this point. It's enjoyable. I like doing a lot.
Does it come naturally, easily?
I taught myself screenwriting in college, so I've always been pursuing it in some form, and therefore feel fairly comfortable in the form. It is very different in obvious ways, namely making it more visual as opposed to interior, and requiring a plot that's much more propulsive and no room for scenes where little happens. But a lot does change in each one.
Any other questions?
thank you guys again. I wrote most of this book during the height of the pandemic. I want to thank my sisters-in-law who are here, Frances and Molly Braidhead, who lived with me in the house of a lot of people. I did a lot of childcare and would have taken much longer to write it without that. And my wife, Kate, who disappeared with my son, who held things together throughout as well. And my 2 kids, Phoebe is with a babysitter now, but I wrote almost all this. I write every day during my son's 3-hour afternoon nap next to him. I have to lie in bed next to him or else he wakes up. And really wrote the whole thing with him there. At the beginning of the pandemic, I feel like he was making me put my arm under his neck as he napped. I couldn't type for a while. It was hard. So, as difficult as it was, I know I will never. And I'm happy to sign books and so on.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Thank you.